Hello, I'm Brandolyn Tebow, and I'm about to interview Dr. Carolyn Heldman as a part of our online course, Rebel Embodied. Rebel Embodied is an online course designed to empower women with the knowledge to better understand how our self-image and our relationship to our bodies is really political, and what we can do about it to not only change the way we think about and relate to ourselves, but also how we can change the culture, the oppressive culture of the beauty myth, the oppressive culture of fat phobia, the oppressive culture of diet culture as well. And probably the number one person who has contributed to my own understanding of how systems of oppression function and how we internalize these systems of oppression is my professor, Dr. Carolyn Heldman. I went to Occidental College, and she was my professor for several classes. She was also my academic advisor, and she was the advisor for the organization, the animal rights organization that I started, Veg Club. And now she has become a dear friend. I love and respect her very much. She is my idol, and I want to read her bio. Normally I would shorten it, but really I feel like you all need to know who this person is and how very much she has accomplished and contributed in this world before listening to this interview. So, Dr. Carolyn is the executive director of the Representation Project, which is a nonprofit which uses film and media as catalyst for social transformation. The Representation Project inspires individuals and communities to challenge limiting gender stereotypes and shift norms. She is also a professor at Occidental College in Los Angeles, and she is a senior research advisor for the Gina Davis Institute for Gender in Media. Her research specializes in media, the presidency, and systems of power, race, class, gender, sexuality, and ability. Dr. Carolyn's books include Rethinking Madam President, Are We Ready for a Woman in the White House?, Protest Politics in the Marketplace, Consumer Activism in the Corporate Age, Women, Power, and Politics, The Fight for Gender Equality in the United States, The New Campus Anti-Rape Movement, and Sex and Gender in the 2016 presidential election. Dr. Carolyn has been active in real-world politics as a professional pollster, campaign manager, and commentator for CNN, MSNBC, Fox News, and CNBC. She also has been featured in popular documentaries including Misrepresentation, The Mask You Live In, The Hunting Ground, Informant, Equal Means Equal, and Liberated. Dr. Carolyn was one of several women who went public with allegations of gender discrimination against Bill O'Reilly that led to his firing from Fox News in 2017. She splits her time between Los Angeles and New Orleans, where she co-founded the New Orleans Women's Shelter and the Lower Ninth Ward Living Museum. Dr. Carolyn also co-founded End Rape on Campus, Faculty Against Rape, and End Rape Statute of Limitations. Also, this is something I just learned about her. Master Heldman holds a 4th degree black belt in Taekwondo. So she is a woman of many, many, many talents, and I'm so excited to bring you this wonderfully informative interview.
Yay.
Yay, okay, all set.
So I'll tell you a little bit about the online course that we're doing, just so you have some context. So I, as you know, have been in this space of like transformation and healing and empowerment for women for years now. And I've realized that like a lot of this space is all about just dealing with what's within, like dealing with your own thoughts, your own emotions, all of that. And it's in this vacuum where we're not actually talking about like why we have the thoughts that we have, why we have the shame we have about our bodies, why we have these fears. And you know, there's this whole other layer of the political aspect of it that when I work with my clients, I find that a lot of people who come to me with an eating disorder, with body image issues, what they actually need is to be educated about why they have those issues to begin with, and like what the systems of power are that are in place that's making them think and feel these things about themselves. And I find that when they understand that, it's so much easier for them to liberate themselves from it.
Yeah.
It's almost like this like sacred rage comes out, this this anger, and they get that it has nothing to do with them, that it's like this chip that was planted in their brain when they were born into this Western capitalist patriarchal society. So I teamed up with a friend of mine who also works in this space on educating women about the nature of their self-hatred, the nature of their body image issues, the nature of their eating disorders, etc. And we put together a course that's really like a crash course in the politics of the way we see ourselves, in a sense. So we really explain internalized oppression, and we explain hierarchies of power, and how feminism, or how like racism and sexism plays into fat phobia, and plays into diet culture, and plays into the beauty myth.
Right.
In an attempt to give women another option, and to really like have awareness of the water they've been swimming in. So that's kind of what the course is about. The first half of it is all just like education on how these systems of subjugation work, and then the second half is about like actual inner work tools. So how to really deal with this poison that's kind of been put into our system our whole lives. So obviously you're a huge part of my understanding these concepts to begin with. So thank you so much for taking the time to be willing to speak with me about this and help.
Yeah, I'm glad we can fit it in. Sorry it's been so crazy. It's just been a nutty little couple weeks.
Yeah, I feel like your life always is. You're just like the most productive human on the planet.
Oh my God, I wish.
Yeah, awesome. All right, so are you ready to dive on in?
Yeah. How's the frame? Does that work for you?
Yeah, that's great. That's awesome. Okay, so the first question I have is, how is the way that we think about our bodies inherently political?
Well, politics is about who gets what, when, and how, right? So it's ultimately about who gets value and who gets resources. So it's about, at its core, power. And so bodies and being comfortable in your own skin is inherently political, because we're born into a world that tells us that certain bodies get to have value, and that other bodies do not get to have value. And so in a fundamental way, our bodies and our comfort with our bodies, and comfort with the space we take up in the world, and the way in which the world views us and places value on our body, is really about the value that it places on us as a human. And so, for example, fat bodies are not given the same social status as thin bodies, right? Fit bodies are given more social status than bodies that are not fit. Bodies that fit, for women that conform to this almost, alien size zero, very thin body frame, oftentimes, achieved through eating disorders and a lot of pain and suffering. Like, that body is elevated and given more stature, but at what personal cost?
So fat phobia and body discrimination is one of the social justice issues that is a little different than others, because if I'm born into a white body or a black body or a male body or a female body, it's a lot harder for me to change that. Whereas we are made to believe that we can change our bodies to fit this body hierarchy, and we're given real rewards and privileges for conforming to the beauty standards. So what do we do with that as women, knowing that to put all of this time and energy into trying to force our bodies to conform to these standards, knowing that that will come with real rewards and privileges, but at such a personal cost? What do we do? How do we say no to that? Do we say no to that?
Well, I think the interesting thing is that even if you achieve a lot of value for your body as a woman, you're ultimately still in a disempowered position. So if we think about how we simplify the world, right, we tend to simplify it into hierarchies. So the hierarchy that is at play with bodies is the subject-object hierarchy, right? So we as girls are born into this world believing that our highest value is our bodies, and that what we need to do is become the most desirable sex object that we can, except that we're still an object, right? So the ways in which we simplify the world, subjects act and objects are acted upon. And so if subjects act and objects are acted upon, sex objects, even the most valuable sex objects ever, are still in a position of power under sexual subjects. And I think the easiest way to think about this, and it's not something that women think about an awful lot, but when we are trying to get attention and value for our bodies because we have been told that that's what we're supposed to do and that's where our value comes from, we are sex objects who are trying to get attention from other people, right? So that's very different than being sexual. Being sexual is for us, our sexual pleasure. Being sexy is for others. So we're born into a world that asks us to be sexy and to give away our power 100 times a day. Because not only are we consumed with these ideas of how our body looks and how we'll never be good enough, or even if we do feel like we've achieved something, we're still consumed with the way we look. At the end of the day, we're still placing our value on what other people think of us. And so we're literally just giving away our power and our agency constantly. So even those who have, the most to gain from this, so women who are hegemonically beautiful, white, skinny, all of the things that in this, in US culture that we value for women, we're still in a position where we're, subordinate, where we're not powerful.
Right. And if I'm in a career, which I argue are most careers in this country, unfortunately, but if I'm in a career where I know that I will be praised more, I will have more job security, I might even get paid more if I lose weight, get plastic surgery, spend all this time and money on my appearance. And I also am somebody who wants to contribute to changing these cultural norms and making the world better for women. But I know that the more money I make and the more position of power I have, the more chance I'll get to change. What do I do in that situation? Do I give up the privileges that I know I would get by conforming?
So very few women actually benefit financially from this, right? And we're talking about musicians, we're talking about actors, but it's a fraction of 1% actually benefit from having hegemonically attractive bodies, right? So at the end of the day, I think a lot of us believe that we will benefit from it in ways that we actually do not. So for example, in a workplace setting, we know that women who are seen as sexy are actually rated as having lower competence, which affects their evaluations of leadership. So for the vast majority of jobs that actually entail good wages and power and leadership positions for women, it does not help us to be physically attractive in those positions, which should be an indicator, right? That the ways in which we conceive of power in our culture are antithetical. They run against the grain of female attractiveness. The positions where women, do the vast majority of positions where women are benefiting from their bodies, whether it's, stripping or it's, even the service sector, these are low paying positions, right? Where we do tend to value women's bodies. But I think rather than buying into this idea that somehow we're going to get something more in these spaces at the expense of our humanity, I think the better approach would be that we need to create different spaces, and we need to reject the idea, fundamentally reject the yardstick of women's worth being based on their bodies. And even if you're in a, someone who's accepted in the world and very attractive, it doesn't matter. That system is stacked against every woman, because as you age out of it, your value will decline. It is a system of rules that encourages girls and women to hate their bodies, to never be satisfied with their bodies, even if they do achieve some sort of status with their bodies, to constantly be, dieting. So 2/3 of American women are engaged in some sort of restricted or disordered eating. There's a smaller percentage engaged in pretty, extreme eating disorders. All of this for a system that even if you achieve the highest amount of attention still isn't going to benefit you, because you're still in a subordinate position where someone else is validating your worth based upon something that you really don't have a lot of control over. It's mostly your genetics, right? What you're born into the world with. And then on top of that, you hit a certain age. Every woman, doesn't matter what she tries, to do, her value and status will decline, because the yardstick is, it's flawed, right? So what we really need is a new paradigm. We actually need to stop valuing girls and women for their physical appearance.
Mm-hmm. I can personally verify everything that you've said. I was in the modeling industry and was caught in this mental loop of, well, the way that I can get power and make a change in the world is by conforming to these standards. So let me starve myself, let me do everything that I think is in my power to try to conform so that I can gain power as this object. And it took me years of my life that I gave away to that pursuit to realize that that was never going to happen. But in our minds, we think, oh, well, if I'm always going to be seen as an object in society, then I want to be seen as the most worthy object that I could possibly be seen as. So is there a way out of this? Is there a way for us to stop being seen as an object, stop internalizing our own objectification?
Well, so yes and no. I'm not naive enough to think that, by switching something in our minds that we can shift the culture, because regardless, so I've rejected this idea that my body is my value, right? But it doesn't change the fact that when the world views me, I'm still being evaluated based upon my body, right? And in different sectors, being evaluated in different ways. But at the end, so it's not enough for us to just have awareness that this is a problem. And it's not even enough for us to individually fight against this. It has to be a systemic change in our culture. And I don't think it's going to happen anytime soon, because if you look at what's driving it, it's capitalism driving it, right? Plus misogyny. So the baked in societal hatred of women together with profit. So if you look at what the mechanics here are, economically, the gap between where you think you are and where marketers tell you you need to be, right? The bigger that gap, the more products you're going to buy. So there is an incentive for companies to make sure that women are never satisfied with their bodies. And the more body hatred, shame, that you can promote, the more products women are going to purchase. And so, and the more they're going to engage in invasive procedures on their bodies that actually reduce their sexual pleasure, like, breast augmentation or vaginoplasty. So that the more money we're going to spend. And so this is a long way of saying it's not going to change. So what do you do as an individual to navigate this? And there are all sorts of ways you can navigate it, right? You can make sure that you don't appear too sexy in certain settings because it'll be held against you. But then can you go into a workplace with no makeup on? No, that'll also be held against you. So I think the first step is really being aware of kind of the landmines around all of this, like how your appearance is used both to help you and against you. And by and large, it's used against women, but also rejecting a lot of the baggage that comes with that. So I think some of the one thing to do is to reject this idea that heterosexual male attention is important. This idea that somehow our value is based upon this, like, just reject it, see it for the absurdity that it is. And it is absurd because when you look at how boys are kind of boxed in and raised to be men who compulsory have to consume women visually and otherwise in order to be real men, they're not doing it because there's, some intrinsic value to it or because it's what they want to do. They're going out to prove their manhood, and this is how they do it. And so it doesn't mean anything, right? Their attention is compulsory and wired into some really jacked up gender norms on their end. But at the end of the day, what does it matter if some dude at a red light thinks I'm hot? It just doesn't matter. And yet that's how we spend our days, wrapped up in this, right? So rejecting that, understanding that it's an issue, rejecting that, and then really digging deep into figuring out how this broken system has affected your individual psyche. How badly do you hate your body? Are you engaged in, disordered eating? Do you have an eating disorder? Are you constantly engaging in habitual body monitoring where you're thinking about your body? And if so, how can you maybe document it on your smartphone to try to interrupt some of those scripts? And then things like, sexual pleasure? Are you really present when you're engaging in sexual activity, or are you so, wrapped up in your body that it's somehow, it's affecting your ability to experience sexual pleasure? Are you competing with other women? And this is a big one, right? So I actually go into a room. We all know, we go into rooms, we know where we are in the pretty girl pecking order. It's something that women do, I think, as a matter of routine, and we never talk about it. I make a point of finding, the women who are at the top of that pecking order and making sure that I reach out to them. If I ever feel a pang of jealousy or envy or competition, I overcome that through my actions and reaching out to them and making sure that they feel loved and accepted, not because of the way they look, but because of who they are, because they face competition from women all the time and are erased and treated poorly. And I know I'm saying, oh, pretty girls are treated poorly. I try to treat all women with a lot of love and respect, but make a point to not compete with other women and really overcome that on a daily, sometimes hourly basis.
Wow, that gave me chills. That's amazing. Yeah, I love these action steps because we all have these ingrained triggers that our patriarchal, capitalist, misogynistic society has put in us, and we've been trained to see other women as competition, and like they're going to take this finite resource of male attention away from us, and we must fight for it. So I love that you call yourself out on it and actually say it and have a conversation about it. Do you ever acknowledge to these women that you were triggered by them, or do you just make a point to be loving?
If we become friends, yeah, it becomes a point of conversation. And, we always see ourselves, we don't see ourselves, right? We always think that people see us in certain ways in which they don't. And so it's, I, as an aside, I will say I've never met a really beautiful woman who knows she's beautiful, because that's also a function of all of this. Not that I care, right? So this idea of, oh, well, everybody can be beautiful. No, I actually don't give a shit what people look like. Like I want to move to a point where it doesn't matter what you look like. So trying to be more inclusive in saying, no, everyone's beautiful, is still reinforcing a shallow standard, and one that we all age out of. So I would really love to see, I would love to see us as a culture move away from that at all as a yardstick. And one of the most damaging things, that we pass from generation to generation is going up to little girls and saying, oh, you look beautiful, right? Because we're just reinforcing this idea that your value comes from the way you look. And it is a superficial value. It's one that's, it's a misogynistic value. It's one that we don't have a lot of control over, even though, we like to act like we do. At the end of the day, did you win the genetic lottery? Yes or no, right? And there's your value. And yet, even if you did win the genetic lottery as a woman, you're still not going to be seen as fully human. And I think this gets to a really important point that, the more that women see themselves as sex objects, the higher their rates of depression and eating disorders and cutting and high-risk behaviors and sexual dysfunction and female competition. So all of this has been directly linked to whether or not you view yourself as a sex object. And so if we can really just reject that entire paradigm, and in our daily lives make sure that we're not passing that along, and make sure that we're not part of the problem, right? That we're not, oh, what are those female presidential candidates wearing? Can you believe she wore that on stage? Like, who cares what she is wearing? I really want to move to a more meritorious society, because men get a little more merit. It's not entirely merit-based, but when we evaluate men, we evaluate them based upon what they've achieved in life and their salary, right? And so that's not entirely meritorious, but there's certainly more room for play. We base it upon the outcomes of what they have done, right? Whereas for women, we base it on outcomes that are not really in their control.
Mm-hmm. I know that you do a lot of work around preventing sexual assault on college campuses and raising awareness about it. How do you think that issue correlates to objectification culture?
Well, the first step in violence against any group is dehumanization, right? So if you look throughout history, the groups that have been targeted for violence, for genocide, whether it's individual level violence or group level violence, or even, nation state violence, the very first step in justifying violence against that group is dehumanizing it. So if you look at the widespread objectification of women and how normal it is in US culture, there you have it, right? So objectification is the process of turning a human being from a subject into an object, right? Someone who acts and has agency into a thing that is acted upon. So when we are surrounded by 5,000 images of advertisements per day now in the new social media age, and so many of those advertisements show women as sex objects, we are constantly, reinforcing this idea that women are objects, and it's dehumanizing. So to draw the link between women's widespread objectification in US culture and sexual violence is actually, it's a pretty close link. If you denigrate and you dehumanize an entire group of people, it is not surprising to me that we have such high rates of sexual violence against them. And when you look at what sexual violence is, it's not acts of sex, right? It's acts of power using sex. So we tell half of our population that women exist for them. We reinforce this idea that women are objects who exist for their visual, their sexual pleasure. And then we are surprised that we dehumanize a whole group and then empower men and have men believe that they're entitled to access to women's bodies in this fashion, that women are, subhuman or women are dehumanized. Of course, we have high rates of violence against women. We send messages to men that women exist for them as objects, and we send messages to women that we exist as objects for men.
Mm-hmm. So it's a lot easier to enact acts of violence and insult and degrade and assault someone, if that person occurs to you as an object. And the more that person
Absolutely.
occurs to you as an object, the easier it is to overcome whatever cognitive barriers you might have to enacting that violence on that person.
Exactly. And in fact, we now have relatively recent research that shows that people who view women as sex objects, a couple of things happen. The first thing is that men and women who view sexualized images of women view them as a collection of body parts rather than a whole person. So we view them as a collection of parts, meaning an object rather than a whole person, a sentient being. The second thing is that men who see women as sex objects are less likely to care about their pain and suffering. And I think it's important to note that this research from Heflick and Goldenberg, a couple of studies from them, focused on Sarah Palin, who is a Republican presidential candidate, or was in vice presidential candidate in 2008. And what they found is that Republican men who sexualized Sarah Palin were less concerned about her pain and suffering as a human being. So we have direct evidence that portraying women as sex objects encourages people to view women as parts instead of a whole, and encourages us on a mass scale to care less about their pain and suffering. And you combine that with this entitlement that we teach men, that they have access to women's bodies and that they have access to women as bodies. Then yeah, I mean, it's just an explosive combination, which generates very high rates of sexual violence, both in the United States and across the globe. And we're talking, 1 in 3 women is the target of sexual violence during her lifetime across the globe.
Wow,
It's an epidemic.
Evidence right there.
If 1 in 3 people were robbed or carjacked or, had or were beaten up over the course of their lifetime, we would care a lot more. We would care about that, except that this is, we care less about gender-based violence because women matter less in our culture than men.
Right. The similar thing we do to animals, we just make them complete objects so we think we can do whatever the hell we want to them.
Well, and you think about the link between that, what's the quickest way to dehumanize a human being is to treat them or talk about them like they're an animal. Yeah, so it's all interconnected. Mm-hmm. In profoundly disturbing ways.
Yeah. So given that there's this obvious link between objectification culture and violence towards women and the subjugation of women, et cetera, do we as women have a duty or a moral responsibility to not participate in that culture, to not take roles in movies that are objectifying, to not get breast implants and pay towards that industry, to not taking roles where, as a news anchor, where it's our duty to get Botox, et cetera, do we have a duty to not participate?
Well, yeah, that's a really tough question. I think I would hope that women would be able women who feel the need to get breast augmentation or plastic surgery or engage in invasive procedures that reduce their sexual pleasure would owe it to themselves, maybe not to do that. But with that said, we're born into this culture. It's not fair. And so I don't hold it against women for participating in it. I don't hold it against women for knowingly participating in it. I don't think women are the problem. And I understand, a lot of people want to wag their finger and say, no to prostitution or sex work, and no to plastic surgery and these sorts of things. I envision a world where those things don't exist, or they don't exist in their current form. They look radically different. I envision a world that is not a patriarchy, where we value men more than we value women. And I think that, objectification culture would disappear overnight if we actually valued women in our culture. With that said, I don't hold it against women, any woman who participates in this, because she is having to navigate it. Now, do I think a lot of us participate in it without even thinking about it and end up upholding it? Yes. But it's a tough thing to say, look, don't participate in this culture for the greater good of women, even though it might come at some personal cost for you to back out of it. I think as a group, it would be great if women could really come together and push against this. But in the meantime, I save my criticisms and my anger and my advocacy for the corporations that are pushing it, for the institutions that are pushing patriarchy, much more than the women who are trying to figure out how to navigate it and maybe not doing so great a job.
Because that's victim blaming in a sense, right? Yeah, got it. So what can we do to rally together to demand change?
Well, I think we can do things at the interpersonal level, which I've talked a bit about, right? This idea that we can reject it, we can recognize it and reject it in our daily lives, but we still have to be a part of it. We can't totally transcend these systems, so we still have to go into work and wear makeup to be taken seriously, but not too much makeup, because then you won't be taken seriously. It's ridiculous. But also, I think at a cultural level or a societal level, we can make sure that the next generation of girls doesn't get this message by interrupting it, both on, on an individual level, but also in our media content. We need to shift our media content. You want to shift the culture, stop objectifying girls and women in entertainment media. And then at a policy level, right? We can, there's legislation working through in Massachusetts right now to get advertisers to stop airbrushing ads, right? To set up various systems where the objectification of girls and women is a little more difficult or just doesn't exist. There are also campaigns like consumer activism. So Julia Blum a few years ago gathered almost 100,000 signatures and went to 17 magazine in New York and got them to stop airbrushing their models. So stop with the depictions of unrealistic body images, stop promoting the idea that our body is our worth. So if there was a single thing that we could do, like the most important thing at a structural level, I think we can do is really demand as consumers that our media not sexually objectify girls and women. And that means, that female performers, women who are in the music industry shouldn't have to be half clothed, whereas their male counterparts don't have to engage in that behavior, right? Or that type of image, that we demand that our movie star, that rates of sexual objectification in popular films it runs 12 times more for women than it does for men. We need to demand that content shift. And if we could truly shift our media to not value girls and women based upon sexual objectification and their appearance and bodies, then we could actually shift the culture.
Mm. And do you think it's possible for us on a personal level to really heal our body image shame, to heal these issues that we have with ourselves and our bodies without understanding the political aspect of that, without understanding what's happening on a broader scale?
I think it might be impossible to heal regardless. I think it's such an ingrained part of who we are that I think recognizing it is great, but then it's going to be a lifelong struggle. It's kind of like racism and sexism, right? Where you recognize how the structure works and then it doesn't go away. You have to struggle against those thoughts and feelings and ideas and attitudes and beliefs and behaviors your entire life. The constant struggle to be a better person. With that said, I think you can't truly even begin the healing process unless you understand that it's not your fault. And how do you understand that it's not your fault? you understand where it came from, the broader culture and the, the heteropatriarchal capitalism that is driving women to hate their body. I mean, I don't know how you can really start to heal unless you really understand that you've been duped as part of a larger system, and all women and girls have been duped in this system, and boys and men, I would argue too, about our bodies, about us, our status in society. So yeah, I think it's understanding the politics of it, and the power dynamics of it, and the fact that it's not our fault. That's really the first step in starting this very difficult lifelong healing process.
And speaking of racism and classism, how do those two things tie into the myths that we have about our bodies? The myth that fat cells are disease cells and fatness is pathological, and that thin bodies are better and healthier bodies. How do these other isms tie into those myths?
Well, it's all of these systems of power intersect, and so in so many different ways. But it's interesting you bring up, I mean, so women of color, for example, experience objectification, what I call objectification plus. So, for example, as a white woman, I am experiencing objectification in the culture, but women of color experience their reduction to a sex object plus some other aspect that having to do with their race. So if you look at advertisements, for example, you see that for Black women, it's often objectification plus animalization. So they're often, presented in cages or in animalistic positions or with animal prints. With Latinx women, it's objectification plus this kind of stereotypical, sexually livacious, can't be satiated, sort of, a spicy Latina stereotype. For Asian American women or Asian women, it's objectification plus, and there's a couple here, a submissiveness, right? So you often see that in advertising, and also exotification. So she's objectified plus she's exotified. And so you see, a higher value being placed on white women's bodies than the bodies of women of color. But you also see, everybody's reduced to a sex object, but the ways in which they're reduced to a sex object very much is informed by racial stereotypes in ways that cause the oppression of women of color using objectification to be amplified much more than white women.
Mm. And would you say that as on the outside, it looks like people of color and women, etc., are getting more rights over time? Would you say that that's resulted in us internalizing our own oppression even more, because it's almost like this counterbalance of the culture that wants to keep its status quo? The models and the actresses get thinner over time, and the beauty standard gets more and more stringent over time to balance out these outward rights that we're gaining, supposedly.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. So there are theories about this, right? But Colette Downing has this great book in which she argues that as women get more rights politically, socially, and economically, they're literally taking up less space, right? And so at the individual level, I'm sure that there's some internalization of, your own oppression, but at the cultural level, there's certainly this kind of pushback against the gains that women and people of color have made. And it all kind of, the backlash, which is what we call it in academia and in activism, the backlash against social progress tends to be pretty standard, whether you're talking about, 2 steps forward for civil rights and then 1 step back because of the backlash for race rights or gender justice. And so, yes, we're definitely in a moment now where women have more power on paper, but in terms of status in society, young women have internalized the idea that we should be sex objects by and large. And a lot of that too had to do with, third wave feminism, which was really fantastic in that it opened up feminism to be way more diverse and challenged the supremacy of white women's feminism, even though I will argue the second wave of feminism was driven and dominated by women of color, and that gets erased in a lot of the discussion about the second wave. But one of the things that the third wave did do, and we're talking now mid to late 90s, is that feminists lost the vocabulary for critiquing sexual objectification. And so we have now 2 generations of young women who have no idea how damaging this is. And in fact, when you point out how damaging the normalization of women's sexual objectification is, oftentimes it's taken as being a personal critique on their lifestyle choices, or a personal critique on women who engage, you know, in using their bodies in order to make profit or to gain fame. And so it ends up being, you know, it ends up being this struggle, whereas I don't think it would be a struggle if we all had a shared understanding of where this comes from and why it's damaging to girls and women. Yeah, but it is a little sad to kind of see that consciousness turn off, a consciousness that we were pretty well aware of with feminism in the 60s and 70s. It's just gone.
Why do you think that erasure happened?
So the third wave, early third wave feminists were driven by, if you read a lot of the theories and writings, driven by this idea that choice is what matters the most, right? So as long as girls and women have choice, then it's feminism. And so it basically opened up feminism to anything. I mean, I love the idea that, you know, women should have choices, but when you're making choices that uphold patriarchy, I think we should still have the vocabulary to say that. I think, to put it crassly, the third wave was driven by a lot of young women who didn't want to give up heterosexual male attention. And so they wanted to be empowered in the workspace and doing all of these great, you know, walking through all these great doors that the second wave opened, but they were terrified of losing heterosexual male attention. So at the end of the day, they ended up being very progressive on this side and then being very regressive on this side, to the point where we've lost the vocabulary to even talk about this. And in fact, when we bring it up, a lot of women get very defensive and feel that it is a personal attack rather than a critique of a culture that is produced a game that is stacked against them.
Got it. So it occurred to these women that the benefits of being a sex object were too great to lose. So there's that fear of, but who would I become if I had to give up these privileges?
Yeah, in a sense, although the benefits of being a sex object are nil, right? And so I think it was maybe more driven by this fear of not being validated by men, right? This deep-seated, men get to be the validators of everyone, right? Men get to validate the masculinity and the value of other men, and men get to validate the value of women. And I think for women, it's really scary for us to think about moving away from caring about heterosexual male attention as the basis for our worth. I will tell you, being on the other side of it, and a lot of, you know, it's pretty well rejected in lesbian communities. It's not, when you stop using male validation as your measure of worth, it's incredibly liberating. And then you start to see how kind of useless it is, that you really shouldn't be giving your power away that many times per day to some external force, especially to strangers you'll never see again, right? That you need to have an internal moral compass and know who you are, know what your values are, and say, look, I'm measuring my worth based upon how in alignment I am with my values. So you are the only person who really should be measuring your worth. You shouldn't be giving that power away to other people multiple times per day, especially strangers.
Mm-hmm. And do you think what it takes for women to be confident enough to make that shift away from prioritizing male attention is women who are on the other side of it saying, it's great over here, come join me, it's really awesome, it's so wonderful and liberating to be on the other side of it?
Yeah, absolutely. And also I think women are not happy, right? We're not happy when we really think about it, with basing our value on what somebody else thinks. Mm-hmm. It's not, so women who are on that side of it, who maybe haven't thought about it very critically, what I find is that the moment at which I kind of say that to a woman, she gets it. It's like, oh, click moment, like, oh, what have I been doing? I didn't see that, now I see it, and I'm not happy with this sort of game or system. It doesn't work for me. And so, yeah, I think women in general are pretty unhappy about the space that we take up in the world, and once we understand that we're not alone in that, and it's not our fault, and it comes from these bigger systems, and these bigger systems will, you know, eat us up and spit us out. I think once we realize that we're all in this together and it doesn't benefit us, then it becomes really easy to push back against it. And you still have to navigate it, but at least recognizing that it is there, I think is a first really big step. And then, yeah, there are all sorts of women who are supportive of other women, and online forums and spaces, and the work that you're doing, and going on social media and seeing women supporting other women and in real life. I mean, there are plenty of resources and support for women who want to escape objectification culture.
Yeah, absolutely. Just making the invisible water that we're swimming in visible, because before it's visible, it's not even a choice. It's just a default way of life. So I think that's what happens when you speak that to women and they're like, oh, I get it. It's like all of this that was in their blind spot is revealed to them. And they're like, oh, of course I would never choose that. It's just that I didn't realize that I'd been choosing it. It just seemed like that's the way it is.
Right. Wasn't a choice. And then we can put our energy into things like, making sure that fat women don't face fat phobia and sizism, and like, getting beyond ourselves and starting to serve other women, and making sure that they know that they are loved and accepted and that they don't have to put up with this. And imagine what would happen tomorrow if all of these, women who fit the hegemonic norm of being, skinny and a rail, if we all said, I'm sorry, we don't appreciate the ways in which big women are being treated. Like, we could shift the culture tomorrow. And that's what it takes too, right? That sort of allyship, that solidarity. So not just rejecting it for ourselves, but if we are in a position of body privilege, that we use that body privilege to really speak out and against people for whom the system is not working now.
Mm-hmm. And I know you have to go, so this will be my last question. What would you say to anyone who watches this video and is like, well, it's easy for you two to say all of this. You fit the beauty norm, and you are white women, and you are thin, and you are etc. So who would discredit this knowledge coming from us because we don't have to face some of the barriers that people in larger bodies and Black bodies, etc. face?
Mm-hmm. My response would be that I have nothing to gain, right? If the system really if it actually benefited me, I probably wouldn't. I mean, I would hope I would be critical of it, but I probably wouldn't be, right? It doesn't benefit me either. And so if I am supposed to be benefiting from the system, but clearly see the problems and are not benefiting from it because it's dehumanizing me, if that's the case, then I think, it's an easy sell that this is a problem for a lot of women who don't fit the mold, right? Also, I would just point out that while you and I might, fit this now, we won't eventually, right? No, women age out of this system. Evidence that it is not a meritorious good system that is furthers women and our humanity, and so I can see that that criticism, except that at the end of the day, nobody benefits from this system. It is a game that is rigged against all women. And while it might be more obvious the ways in which it's rigged against some women, it is just as rigged against, heteronormatively attractive women as it is against women who don't fit that mold. It doesn't benefit any of us. It harms all of us. And so imagine the possibility of action and change and progress if all women got together and rejected this system, and didn't fall under the delusion that somehow it's helping some of us. It just isn't.
Mm-hmm. Wow, awesome. Thank you so much. This has been wonderfully informative. Thank you so much for taking the time to share with us, and for just all of the work that you do to change these norms and change these systems and to educate people so that they can empower themselves to leave behind these systems that are clearly not serving any of us.
Thank you, Brandy, for all of your work on this. And I love the allyship and the growing circle of knowledge and people who are invested in helping other women feel good in their own bodies. My goodness, can't we just wake up in the morning and feel good in our own skin, right? In our own bodies? Can't we aren't we entitled to just wake up as human beings and just be okay?
We so are. We so are. Yeah. Let's hold that vision for the world until it's a reality.
Yes.
Beautiful. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Brandy.